Hello and welcome to Cadence Health's webinar on dietary fats. Shortly we'll have a look at just what we're going to cover. We would expect that this webinar will take roughly about 20 to 30 minutes. Okay, just to introduce myself, my name's Leanne Cooper. I'm a registered nutritionist and I'm the director here at Cadence Health. Cadence Health, we are a health coaching college. We provide continuing education courses to the fitness and health sector. We also provide qualifications in lifestyle, food and wellness coaching, which are internationally recognised. This is one of a number of webinars. We're increasingly moving towards more funky sort of online education, so we hope you enjoy this. This was a live recording and you're now listening to the actual recording afterwards, so I hope you enjoy. So let's have a look at what we'll look at in this session. We're going to start with lipid classification and structure. This is important because it gives us an indication of the healthfulness of a particular fatty acid. Whereas once we thought that we could simply class fats according to their saturation, for example, bad fats were saturated fats and good fats were unsaturated. We know that we can't do that any longer because there are some saturated fats that in fact don't have the same health issues that we once thought. Then we'll have a look at the functions of fat, and the whole point of looking at that is to really show you that fat is absolutely vital for our health, and the whole concept of trying to reduce fat in the diet down to negligible amounts really makes no sense in terms of health. We'll look at the new information around saturated fats, which is what I was alluding to just a moment ago, insofar as some saturated fats or fatty acids we now know don't have the same health issues. And of course, one of the big questions is still how much should we be eating? And this also leads into the whole issue around the low-fat products. And we'll look at some of the issues that there are around those sorts of products, that in fact they don't necessarily equate with being healthy, and nor do they actually help with weight loss strategies and goals. And we'll finish up with cholesterol, looking specifically at the importance of the good cholesterol versus the bad, and that we can't actually once again make a generalization about a cholesterol rating that you might get, say, from a shopping centre blood test, that in actual fact, to understand your risk factor in relation to your cholesterol, we need to know a little bit more about just what's going on inside your blood. So hopefully this shouldn't all be too hair-raising. This is designed to be a reasonably fundamental look at fats. It's not designed to be too laden with chemistry. It's really one of the things we find in nutrition is that all too often we reduce what we eat down to these very small reductionist views of bits of this and grams of that, and we actually lose the broad picture. Sometimes you can just look at a plate and know whether it's an unhealthy meal or whether it's healthy. So we need to really try and remember that some of the very simple things are actually the most important factors in terms of our how we eat healthfully. So let's start by looking at the classification of lipids, that is dietary fats. We can either divide them into simple lipids, such as fatty acids, actual individual fatty acids, or triglycerides, which we'll look at a moment, or we can class them as compound fats, which are a lot more complex, such as phospholipids. Now, phospho meaning it has a phosphorus element to it and it's a lipid. Those particular types of lipids line every single cell in our body. In fact, that particular layer is called a biphospholipid layer, bi meaning two. So there's actually two phospholipids joining the membrane together. And it's extremely important in the transmission of messages and information across the cell membrane. Lipoproteins are quite complex proteins. They're made up of cholesterol and other sorts of compounds, and of course those make up our good and our bad cholesterol in our body. So in terms of simple lipids, we'll start with our triglycerides. Now, triglycerides make up 98% of all the foods, all the dietary fats that we consume. And they're a little bit like a handbag, I suppose you could say. They have a glycerol handle, which is like the backbone, and then they have a combination of fatty acids. So tri meaning three, so there are 3 fatty acids that hang off this glycerol backbone. Now the makeup of, or the combination of those fatty acids off that glycerol base can come from either monounsaturated fatty acids, MUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, or saturated fatty acids. And you can see the abbreviations for each of those there, which we'll continue to use throughout these slides. So you might have a triglyceride that has 2 monounsaturated fatty acids and 1 poly. That might be something that you would find in a relatively unsaturated fatty acid product such as olive oil. Or you might have something that has 3 saturated fatty acids that comes from a food that is largely made of saturated fats, such as coconut oil, for example. Now that doesn't necessarily suggest the healthfulness of that food. We really need to look at the specific length of the saturated fatty acids on that fatty acid chain, which we'll have a look at in a little bit more detail shortly. Alrighty, let's take a quick look at fatty acids. So we can see on a screen we're looking at saturated or mono or poly. The diagram that you're actually looking at is a monounsaturated fatty acid, so I'll come back to that shortly. So saturated fatty acids, let's just consider a little bit of chemistry. So what we're looking at with that diagram of the monounsaturated fatty acid is a carbon chain. So that's all the C's linked together with those lines. And around the outside, by and large, are hydrogens, that's H. So a carbon is a little bit like a human in that it has 4 limbs. It has, like we have 2 arms and 2 legs, that can effectively touch or reach on or latch on to things. Carbon has 4 potential bonds that it can link to another molecule with. So if we look at every one of those carbons, there are 4 limbs or 4 bonds, and most of them are surrounded by a hydrogen. If we're that double line in the middle, which is called a double bond in the middle of that carbon chain, if it were the same as all the others and the 2 carbons had their other hydrogens, other bonds, and the hydrogens completely all the way around them, that would be a saturated fatty acid. In other words, all available bonds on a carbon chain are saturated with hydrogen. That makes it solid. The saturation, or the amount of hydrogen, and that's where you get the term hydrogenation, relates to its saturation and to its whether it's solid or not in room temperature. So as I was saying, what we're looking at in that diagram is a monounsaturated fatty acid. It has 1 double bond. And we'll come back to this, but the location of the double bond also has a lot to do with health. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. Having a double bond means that you can do more things. It means you can break the bond open and you can do all and attach to other things, and which is great for health. And we see a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids in the Mediterranean diet, which we know is one of the best diets that you can follow. One of the downsides, or there's a couple of downsides of having bonds, is that the fat becomes more liquid, it is less stable to heat and less stable to light. So while monounsaturated is relatively stable, so olive oil is a good example, it will resist oxidizing at certain levels, but if you really bump up the heat and you leave it out in the heat or the light too long, it actually goes rancid. Now, a good example of a rancid fat, if you think of the old slab of butter that sat by at the barbecue for too long, or even in a little tub, and it's melted, then you've popped it back in the fridge and you've pulled it back out a few days later or a day later and it's solid again, but it's got this dark layer of yellow around the outside. That's oxidated fats. It's actually rancid, and you shouldn't really eat that. That's the stuff that you want to avoid. Polyunsaturated fatty acids have 2 or more double bonds. So this particularly makes them even more unstable, makes them more liquid, they oxidize quickly, and that's why they say polyunsaturated oils should be kept in the fridge. And they don't normally last more than about 6 months, and they're ideal for using on salads and not for cooking because they do tend to oxidize under heat. So what I'd like to do just before we move on to a little bit more information about saturated fats is to just really show you the importance of dietary fat in the body, that going without dietary fat is really not a great idea. So I've broken it down into two particular types of functions. There's nutrient functions and bodily functions. Dietary fat is carries our fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and E around our body. So it's a form of transport for those. It is also our source of essential fatty acids, EFAs. And essential fatty acids are fatty acids that our body cannot actually produce, that we have to source from our diet. And of course, eating them is the only way we can actually access them. Then body functions. Of course, we all have a certain amount of body fat, which is a stored form of energy, and most of us in the West would argue we probably have too much. In fact, it's still important to have stored fuel, whether it's because you're doing an extreme amount of exercise, whether you're convalescing and you're not taking in enough energy. There's lots of times when your body will require that, so it's essential. We also need dietary fat for the production of a number of hormones, not the least estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. So obviously those are essential for our growth and development and reproduction. We also need dietary fat for insulation and protection. And a really good example is of our kidneys. And if you just pop your hands on your back, just below your waistline, you'll find that there's a slightly spongy sort of area there. That's actually where your kidneys sit. It's called your loins. And the layer of fat that you can feel just below the skin is actually pretty much all that's protecting your kidneys. And what happens is if you take a knock in that area, the kidneys actually absorb the shock from that knock. Of course, dietary fat is great for taste and texture. It makes our food taste nice, and it gives it a if you think of chocolate, imagine as you pop it in your mouth, that melting sort of feeling in your mouth, that's the fat that's melting. It gives it a lovely creamy texture. We also need dietary fat to make our red blood cells, which of course is important for oxygen carrying around our body, and our white blood cells, which is our immune system. And lastly, and we've touched on this when we talked about phospholipids, lipids line every layer of cells in our body. Literally, we would die up, our cells wouldn't be able to communicate, substances wouldn't be able to move in and out. We simply couldn't function if the lipid lining of our cells was not as good as it needs to be. Okay, let's get into some carbon counting, not calorie counting. Here at Cadence Health, one of the things we really try to encourage our students to focus on is not counting calories and making food about numbers, but looking at the quality of food. We think that really has a lot more mileage in relation to healthy eating than just how many calories you might happen to be consuming, or at least a rough guess of it. So carbon counting. Now this is currently the standard for determining the healthfulness or the health impact of a fat. So what we're looking at here, we've got the classification of a saturated fats now based on carbon length and not saturation, as we used to. We used to say saturated fat bad, monounsaturated fat good. So the example we've got here in front of us is stearic acid. Now that's classed as a C18 saturated fat. So if we run our eye along how many C's, which are C for carbon and H on the outside for hydrogen, how many C's there are in that line, if we count all of those up right along to the COOH end, we'll see that there's 18. And hence it's called a C18 saturated fat. Now that's important, and we'll come back to that shortly. It's also important, the carbon counting and the carbon chain in relation to omega fats. So if we have a look at the second image on the screen, this is linoleic acid. If we count from the C3H or CH3 end, so the left end of the carbon chain, to where the first double bond is, we will count along 6. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and on the 6th carbon, and that's called from the methyl end, the CH3 end, is the first double bond, and hence we would call that an omega-6 fatty acid. Now we know it's a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Of course, a saturated fatty acid wouldn't have an omega on it because it doesn't have any double bonds. So if the double bond was on the third carbon, started at the third carbon, that would be called an omega-3 fatty acid. The other end of the carbon chain, the COOH end, is called the acid end. And that has a lot to do with how that particular molecule bonds or draws in or repels water and other fats. So they call them lipolipic or lipophilic. So here we are. We have now arrived at a little bit more on our saturated fatty acids, SFAs. And as we've already alluded to, we know that they're not all bad anymore. So the baddies, if you'd like, currently, as far as the research shows us, is lauric acid, which is a C12, stearic acid, which is a C14, and palmitic acid, which is a C16. And these are all thought to increase LDL cholesterol, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is said to be the bad cholesterol because it tends to deposit fat into our vessels and leaves it there waiting for the HDLs to come and mop it up. So what we can see from those is that all of those fats are slightly shorter chain saturated fatty acids. They range from C12 to C16, whereas stearic acid is a C18 and is thought to have very little effect or a neutral effect on blood cholesterol, blood lipids. In fact, the overall effect of saturated fatty acid on cardiovascular disease, the overall effect of saturated fatty acids on cardiovascular disease actually isn't known. The whole push towards reducing saturated fat because it was thought to be killing us was based on an assumption. It wasn't based on actual research on eating these particular foods with these particular fats and then looking to see just what the relationship was with your health. It was really more on an assumption that was made in the 50s and 60s, and no one ever really challenged it. Interestingly, there is no research or very little research just to the overall effect of saturated fatty acids on cardiovascular disease, CVD. Now, a big question currently is coconut. Is coconut the superfood everyone is, or a lot of people are touting it to be? We don't know. If you look at the research, there is actually very little evidence to suggest that that's the case. Coconut is made up of palmitic, so that's okay, 8%, myristic acid, 13%, and it is predominantly made up of lauric acid, which, as we know, is not an ideal fatty acid. However, people tend to say that it's an MCT, a medium chain triglyceride. That is, predominantly it's made up of short chain fatty acids such as lauric acid, which can be quite easily used up for energy. Well, that's well and fine, but you have to have the physiological conditions for your body to warrant using it as energy in the first place. And those have to do with the type of exercise you're doing, your level of fitness, other things you've eaten at the time, how recently you'd eaten, and so on. So there's a whole range of factors that go into whether your body will use MCTs as a form of fuel. So let's take a look now at unsaturated fatty acids. Now, there has been in the last 10 years a push to swap saturated fatty acids for carbs, and up until about 2 years ago that had a bit of a push. There was a current coming through where people were saying, well, maybe we should look at increasing protein and creating something called a ketotic state, where you're almost having insufficient amounts of carbohydrates to supply the body with the energy that it needs. But research, while that did give some benefit in terms of weight loss, it did tend to be quite temporary, and it was probably based on the assumption that if you eat carbohydrates and therefore sugars, that it stimulates insulin production, which also inhibits the use of fat as a fuel, and therefore potentially increasing your fat deposits and storage, or total body fat. But now recent research has actually shown us that high carbohydrate diets appear to reduce longevity. While they do tend to make you slightly thinner, you don't live as long to enjoy it. So like everything in nutrition, it's all about balance, and it's all about quality. And having lots of protein is not a quality diet. So what the studies have shown, and this has actually been shown historically if we look at diets like the Mediterranean diet, is that what we should be doing is swapping saturated fatty acids for PUFAs, for polyunsaturated fatty acids. There is a great deal of research showing that there are benefits in terms of longevity and your quality of life, but also in terms of health markers and predictors of disease, and even in the outcomes after you've been diagnosed with specific diseases. Doing swapping saturated fatty acids for PUFAs can also help longevity in that regard. So that's the current, never say never with nutrition, but that is the current belief, is that we should be looking at increasing our PUFAs. We can see there our list of PUFAs. Our polyunsaturated fatty acids are divided into essential fatty acids. Notice one is an omega-6 and one is an omega-3. Often people tend to think essential fatty acids are both omega-3s. They're not. One is an omega-6. We do tend to get quite a number of omega-6s. In the West, our diet is more heavily represented towards omega-6s. That in some cases can have an inflammatory outcome. So, even with healthful things like polyunsaturated and saturated fatty acids, there can be a downside. We tend to miss the omega-3 fatty acids more, not just the essential, but the non-essential one as well. So that's the EPA and the ALA are the two omega-3s that we tend to not get enough of. They're found in fish, which is why there's this big push at the moment for krill and so on. And while there is some research supporting the benefits of those, there's also research saying that we're not absolutely sure whether they do some of the things that people are touting them to do, but certainly they appear to provide some real health benefits. And if we look at them in a dietary form over a supplemental form, we actually see even greater benefits. And you'll find this with almost all nutrients. In a dietary form, there are much, much stronger benefits than there is in the supplemental form. And we talk about that in the Super Nutrition course. It's a pretty given fact these days. So I think this quote from Food and Ag Organization, the UN, in the UN, it really says it all regarding total fat. For example, several recent reports of prospective observational studies found either no or small associations between total dietary fat intake and obesity, weight gain, coronary heart disease, and cancer risk. In other words, eating lots of fat does not necessarily make you overweight, obese, give you heart disease, or increase your risk of cancer. What we do know is it's about the quality and the ratio of fats. And again, we just come back to very simple fundamentals of nutrition, that what we're eating should be unprocessed. It should be largely in a whole state. It shouldn't have lots of other additives added to it, and it should have had very little processing. It should be good quality. So the Food and Health Organization suggest that they tend to talk now in terms of levels of evidence, and you'll find that in relation to the RDIs as well, or RDAs, depending on what country you're in, that it's only about a level of confidence. We don't know for certain, other than tax and death, that too much about life, to be really honest. And certainly it's the same for nutrition. We only have levels of evidence and confidence about findings. So there is, as far as we know, there is a convincing level, a fairly strong level of evidence that fats between C12 and C16 in length increase our LDL production and the ratio between LDL and HDL. So in other words, ingesting or eating C12 to C16 saturated fats increases our LDLs and can or may decrease HDL. So we have a huge ratio between the bad and the good fat. In other words, we have more bad cholesterol other and less of the good stuff that mops up the HDLs, high density lipoproteins, that mop up the fat that the LDLs deposit in our arteries. Also, the C6 and the C6 through to the C16s increase LDL, but with no effect on total LDL in comparison to carbohydrate. So listed there are the C12 to C16 saturated fats, and you can see there's palmitic, and you can see where the sources are. There's a lot of them are tropical sort of fats, the myristic, coconut and butter, and again lauric acid in coconut. So it really does question whether coconut is or can be classed as a superfood. It's really not overly clear. One thing that is interesting is, as the quote says in front of you, the consumption of dairy saturated fat is inversely associated with risk, and the consumption of meat saturated fat is positively associated with risk. So we have been having low-fat dairy for so long that it seems like there was nothing before that. And in fact, high-fat dairy doesn't appear to cause any real great health issues. All right, let's take a look at this low-fat business. It is low-fat and it is low on evidence. So we know, if you've done our accredited certificate of nutrition, one of the questions you would have had in your assessment is around a low-fat mayonnaise. And if we look at many of these sorts of low-fat products, we know that fat tastes good. When you take fat out of a product, you are generally going to have to replace it with something that tastes good, and that will either be sugar and or salt, or additives and so on. So many of these sorts of low-fat products can be high in salt, which of course is not great for, as it had a link to high blood pressure and heart disease, and also high in sugar. Now, having a lot of sugar in a product that's supposed to be helping you lose weight, if that's your goal, means that it increases the release of insulin, and insulin prevents your body from utilizing fat stores. In fact, it encourages any fat that's kind of hanging around, whether it be fat that's been esterified during physical activity or whether you've eaten it, to be stored into the fat cells. So it's not necessarily so that a low-fat product is healthful. The evidence just doesn't stack up. So it doesn't support that low-fat products have been effective in weight control. If you look at the very large meta-analyses where they compare the effects of a low-carbohydrate diet versus a low-fat diet, they find that low-fat diets are actually really quite ineffective. Low-carbohydrate diets were more effective in inducing weight loss after 6 months, and 6 months is a critical point. That tends to be when most people fall off the wagon with their diets, and also most diets tend to only last that long, probably because then they know they've been a success, because if you go any longer you're likely to find that it becomes really difficult and people start to find it challenging to stick with it. And then after about 12 months there was absolutely no effect. So these are very large studies that are showing typically that low-fat diets just do not work. In fact, dieting doesn't work. And then the last quote is, the Mediterranean diets appear to be more effective than low-fat diets in inducing clinically relevant long-term changes in cardiovascular risk factors and inflammatory markers. So the reality is, in these sorts of changes where you're looking at swapping to a low-carb diet and a higher polyunsaturated intake, is that you may not lose as much weight as you might if you had done things differently, but the weight you do lose you will keep off, and you can stick with it, and the actual health outcomes as well as the psychological outcomes are far better. So this is something we would look at in the weight loss course, but we know dieting doesn't work. We actually need to take an entirely different view around weight loss and focus it more on a issue of health as opposed to body image. I love this slide. I think it says so much. He's very cute and he is so utterly stuffed that he simply can't stand up. So what we want to take a quick look at is how much fat should we be eating, and how do we know when we've had enough, and how do we know when we're eating the right sort of fat. So let's take a quick look. Let's take a quick look now at how much is enough in terms of fat. Now, the latest information that we've been able to gather is from 2011, and in terms of minimum intakes for adults, the minimum we need in order to have or do just basic sort of functions is around about 15% of energy from fat. We know this largely based on populations where they've got lower consumption of total fat intake. Now, in particular, if we look at women of reproductive age, there is evidence to suggest that they need a minimum of 20%. This is obviously to do with deposition of body fat for the fetus and for birth and so on. And we also know that women or people with a lower body mass index, particularly if you're looking at developing countries where nutrition is often inadequate, need at least a minimum of 20% fat intake. So it's also a good point just to keep in mind that just because you are having enough energy, so you're taking in enough calories, doesn't necessarily mean that you are well nourished. There are a lot of overweight people who are actually very undernourished because they're consuming a diet that's very limited in terms of nutrients but very high in energy. And in terms of the maximum total fat intake for adults, it's believed to be between 30 and 35%, depending on which country you're in terms of the recommendations. Now that's probably a bit higher than most of us are used to. I think the general consensus for a long time was 30%. That's now been pushed out a bit by a number of countries. So as you can see, there's a bit of a shifting sand in this whole area. So in plain language, how do we know what we should be eating? Well, there's some really fundamental principles, and we've said this over and over again, that healthy eating is actually about some basic principles that are quite simple, and if we stick to those, we actually can't go too far wrong. The first thing we need to do is actually enjoy our foods. We really need to avoid using food as a motivator or a punisher or having to restrict it. What we find is when people are restricting food, that it makes it much harder to eat healthfully and to make healthy food choices. Restriction is not the friend of healthy eating. We also know that if we eat a variety of food, of course, we're going to spread out the nutrients that we're getting, but also reduce any contaminants. And we've said this already, we need to focus on quality, the quality of food, making sure it's not processed, that it's as near to what its original starting point is as possible, has less additives in it, and so on. Avoid processed fats and oils. That's a really big, easy one to do. The winterized oils that you get on your supermarket shelves that you can see straight through to the other aisle are not healthy oils. You want the ones that are in dark tins and glasses that are virgin first pressed oils. They are expensive, but you can use less, and they are so much better for you. And of course, they don't have the same amount of trans fatty acids. Recognize portion control by using body signals, not calories. And by that, very few people who tend to overconsume and have trouble with portion control actually often don't know when they're full. They actually don't tune into those signals. A really good thing to get into before you start a meal is to think to yourself just for a moment, am I hungry? How hungry am I? And on that basis, how much should I eat? Just simply do that. And always wait 20 minutes after a meal before you go in for your second helping. It takes 20 minutes for your body to tell you that you're actually full, for all those signals in your brain to switch on. So that can help with portion control. Fish, eggs, and plant-based fats are generally a better option in terms of where you get your fats from. So we're talking about the quality of your fats over processed foods, even butters to a certain degree, but butter is still better than margarine. If a product needs to be fat altered, then really we should be asking ourselves, if it needs to be altered, perhaps we shouldn't eat as much of it. So a really good example is cheddar cheese. It is an energy-dense food. There's no getting away from it, but it's a fabulous food. It's low in lactose, it's high in protein, it's high in calcium. It's a fabulous food. What we should be doing is, rather than saying, I'm going to go and buy myself a low-fat version so I can eat as much as I possibly can stuff, is I'm going to buy a whole fat cheddar cheese and I'm just going to eat small amounts of it. But boy, I'm going to enjoy it. So looking at, instead of having to have industry alter foods so that you can eat them to excess, is actually controlling the foods that you eat rather than allowing industry to do that for you. Being in control of your own diet and eating and what you put in your mouth. And even though fat has lots of energy, it's not just about cutting back because it's about using fat as a fuel. And by that, what I mean is, if you are currently carrying a few extra kilos and you want to reduce them, it is not enough just simply to go low fat or to reduce your energy intake and cut back on the calories. All that's doing is maintaining or keeping you at a level. What you need to do to change your body shape or to change the level of body fat is to move. So what you do when you move is you're accessing the stores that you've put in over months or years or whatever it might be, and you're reducing those as well as improving your diet so you have energy and you are maintaining your health at the same time. It's like a bank. You have a whole bunch of money sitting in there. The only way to access and reduce that amount of money, if you really want to spend it, is to take it out, to physically take it out of the bank. And the only way to take fat out of your body is to exercise. And it is not a helpful way to take fat out of your body by starvation. It will damage your body and it will come back at a later stage. So we're almost there. Let's just take a quick look at cholesterol. Dietary cholesterol, so the stuff that we eat, for example, in prawns, does not correlate to heart disease. The cholesterol you eat is not the same as the cholesterol your body produces. It does different stuff. It's treated completely differently. So when you see advertisers advertising their avocado as cholesterol-free or whatever it might be, it really isn't a great claim to go by in terms of picking a product. Our body can process dietary cholesterol quite efficiently. It's the cholesterol that our body produces in response to our diet, and specifically in response to trans fatty acids. The food in Australia that has the most trans fatty acids, if you do our courses, you'll know, is microwave popcorn, followed by things like processed meats, salamis, and so on. And as we know, some saturated fatty acids are believed to raise blood lipids also. So the important thing to remember is that not all lipoproteins are bad. So HDLs, high density lipoproteins, mop up the fat that's deposited by the low density lipoproteins. And what we really want is to increase our HDLs and keep our LDLs at a relatively low level. We still need them. And there are a number of foods that are reported to do that. For example, onions, garlic, so the sort of onion family, and herbalists certainly have a lot of herbs that they repute can do that also. Fish oils also help with the LDL-HDL ratio. One-off cholesterol readings that you might get somewhere will not give you the information about the ratio of the good to bad cholesterol. It's really important to actually have a fasting blood test to check those. Okay, so we've got to the end. There's a few of the references that have been used in this presentation. Gary Taubes' Soft Science is the article that talks in detail about where we went wrong with our assumption about saturated fats killing us and how that all came to be over the last 50, 60, 70 years. It's a really interesting read. I recommend anyone who's looking at food or health coaching to look at Health at Every Size by Linda Bacon. That's an awesome new modality in terms of diet, where they strongly support the non-diet approach to healthy weight, and we've talked a little bit about that. So I hope you've enjoyed that presentation on dietary fats. There's our websites if you wanted to check out a bit more information on our courses, if you wanted to access some free resources, and also if you wanted to just keep up with the latest via our Facebook, that's there also, just under Cadence Health Courses. I'm Leanne Cooper. I'm the Director of Cadence Health, and it was great doing this recording for you. Eat well, live long, and laugh hard.